Good evening and buenas noches. Welcome everyone, and thanks for tuning in for tonight's community conversation about period poverty. I'm Annabel Rocha, editor and reporter of Illinois Latino News. Our goal for this event is to define period poverty and menstrual inequity, to discuss its invisible impacts, and share the cultural stigmas that often prevent us from openly talking about menstruation. Before we get too far into this, though, I want to remind you that this conversation is available in Spanish. Thanks to our interpreters, Moira Pujols and Alex Gualino. If you'd like to access the Spanish live interpretation of this event, you can find the Zoom link in the comment section of this video on WBEZ's YouTube channel. If you need assistance, please leave a comment and someone will reach out to help you. And if you have a question for the panelists at any time tonight, please leave a comment on YouTube or wherever you're watching, and you may hear it answered in the show. So let's talk about periods. Menstruation is just another biological process, just like eating, breathing, peeing, or sex. More than 2 billion people currently menstruate, and 4 billion have had a period in the past or will in the future. So why do we get so uncomfortable talking about it? I started reporting on period poverty because of the fellowship that I had with the Center for Health Journalism. When I was trying to decide on a topic, I remembered a commercial I had seen years ago that showed young girls in another country who weren't able to attend school because they didn't have period products. I started to do more research and found that this isn't only happening in other countries. This is happening here. In the United States, period poverty impacts houseless, low-income communities, and Black and Brown communities the hardest. And although these are the groups most affected, the people with the highest visibility in the menstrual equity space are white women. I wanted this project to be a more accurate representation of what period poverty looks like by amplifying the voices of those with firsthand experience. And to get a better understanding of how people experience periods, I decided to create a survey that asks these questions directly. Let's take a look at some of the things that folks said. So out of 206 people, 48% said that they've struggled to pay for period products. 39% said that they've experienced period poverty. The median number spent per month on products was $17.50, with some people paying nothing, people who use menstrual cups or other alternatives, and others pay more than $100 a month. So you can see that 48% of people said that they have struggled to pay for period products, but only 39% have said that they have experienced period poverty. And I asked both of these questions because the difference in answers illustrates how under discussed period poverty is. The truth is, if you've struggled to pay for period products, then you actually have experienced period poverty. In this survey, we also asked questions like, what words do you associate with your period? How did you first learn about it? Who do you feel comfortable talking about it with? In the hopes of learning how people understand and navigate their experiences with menstruation. Some survey respondents went above and beyond in sharing their experiences with me. I received video submissions from all over the world. And from them, I learned that the stigma surrounding menstruation runs deep. So let's take a quick look at what some folks said. And just a heads up, in order to create a safe space for open dialogue, for a few people who've shared their stories, we're only going to be referring to them by their first name.
But I definitely felt that it was bad or wrong or dirty.
The first thing that comes to mind is that it's dirty. So that it's nasty, that having a period is bad.
You're supposed to have it, you're supposed to take care of it, and nobody else is supposed to know.
It's always been something that isn't talked about. It isn't acknowledged. It's just something that happens behind closed doors, or like something that, you learn to take care of. Like I remember when I was younger and I would like bleed through my pants in school, like my mom had to pick me up, and it was just like, she told me not to tell anyone what happened.
My mom would always tell me, nobody should know when you have that. No one.
Not really. I've had like a couple times where I did actually buy. But the thing is, just to kind of like put you in the shoes of a woman who has to deal with this, I went out from that pharmacy and I just planned for the rest of my life to never walk in again, because the guy now knows that I've bought like this from him. It's just kind of like it's a really small city, a tight community, one that loves gossiping about like women's honors and behaviors and things like that. So you don't want to really have your dad walk around and like there's another man who knows that his daughter has bought like a pad from, it's just like, it's weird, a weird mentality. It's about like really men's egos. Like men try to hide the fact that they have women, like much less menstruating women. Oh gosh, no.
It was just something that I felt only women could talk to each other about. If you try to talk about it with like my dad, for example, he'd be like grossed out and leave the room.
It was a little bit on the hush hush side. My father, we have a very close relationship, but back then he more or less kept out of it. My mom was the one talking to me about it, making sure that when I used the restroom and when I got up from the commode that I did not leave any trace for my brothers to see so they wouldn't have any questions.
And she didn't say this, but I felt like in a way it's like it's something that when it's happening, you have to be ashamed of it because you have to like hide it. And it's like, oh, like, you know, the men in the house can't handle seeing blood. And it's like, dude, like, I live with this.
There is the masculine, let's say you're moody or something happens, life happens, or are you on your period? Like, why is that your first reaction to it?
Having a period is tied to negative things. So if you're on your period, or like if you're being really emotional, it's like, oh, are you on your period?
I remember once my brother saying, well, she got to buy tampons last time. Why don't I get something? And I was like, bro, are you kidding me right now?
And it's kind of like very frowned upon if a girl or like a woman or a sister just hears that like you've been inserting like something inside of you.
Was tampons son para the people that aren't, you know, virgins anymore. So I was stuck using pads.
You have to be careful because like that's your most precious thing, and like you have to take care of that because that's all you're worth.
Like you're supposed to get it because you're virgin, but other than that, don't talk about it.
Why is that vilified that my body's doing something? It's a beautiful process of my body shedding something that I should be embracing, but I'm being vilified or demonized for it.
I had to start praying and I had to kind of like change the way I behaved and like be more ladylike and go outside less. So all that just came with like these drops of blood coming out of me. And I didn't feel like different. I was just still the same like 12-year-old kid.
I didn't want to look at it. I didn't want to feel the period. I didn't want to smell it, you know. I think it started my journey to not liking myself at that age, actually.
So as you can see, there's so much shame attached to this natural process. Historically, girls and women and people who menstruate have protected themselves by discussing their periods in private or not discussing it at all. This secrecy, however, inadvertently reinforced the idea that menstruation is something to be hidden, something dirty, and something to be ashamed of. We'll explore this discomfort more tonight and do our best to give you the whole story with help of our expert panelists. And we'll also talk about accessibility of period products, how people can experience period poverty and not even know it, gender norms, parenting, and much more. For those who are fighting menstrual inequity, like many of the panelists we'll hear from soon, the general stigmatization of periods actively works against their goals. Shame has a way of shutting people down. And with a subject as personal as menstruation, there's no way to know who's struggling if they're too scared to speak up. And that's exactly why we're here tonight. My goal is to create a safe space where we can openly talk about periods, share our stories and questions, and explore different ways of dismantling the taboo of it all. So now it's my pleasure to introduce to you our first round of panelists tonight. We have Ida Melbye, who's the executive director of the Period Collective. This is an organization focused on providing period products to low-income and unhoused people in the greater Chicago area. And also joining the discussion is Abigail Suleman, who co-founded Blood Buds, a student-run organization at UIC that's working to increase access to menstrual cups and fighting the period stigma. Abigail's working toward her Master of Public Health in Maternal and Child Health Epidemiology. And we have Damaris Pereda, the National Programs Director of Period. Period is an organization which donates so many period products to people in need all throughout the world. And they also advocate for menstrual equity in healthcare policy. So welcome, Ida, Abigail, and Damaris. Thank you all for joining us tonight. So we know the cost of period products can range depending on a lot of factors, but one of the main arguments in the menstrual equity space is that products cost too much. 74% of our survey respondents said that period products are too expensive, and 76% said that they thought they should be free. The costs leave many people having to choose between buying tampons for the month, or buying food, or buying other essential items that they need. Each of you are dedicated to increasing access to free period products in different ways. So I'd like to start off by having everyone kind of define period poverty as you see it in your work and provide a brief overview of how you distribute products. And Damaris, let's start with you.
Hi, thank you. Thank you all for having us. It's a pleasure to be here and with these panelists. I know there's a lot of work happening around the country and around the world. And so it's a pleasure to be here with you all in company. To answer the first question, I am Damaris, thank you. Let me start with that. I'm with Period, and Period is a national organization that exists to equip and train young people to fight period poverty and period stigma. So what is period poverty? And so the way we've seen it is really period poverty is really lacking the essential needs to address the basic menstruation on a monthly basis and what you need. And it's not only the access to products, but it's the access of education and knowledge and education about menstrual health and recognizing the need for the stigma to really go away. So we're really talking about access to products, access to information so that people can really manage their menstruation with dignity and fully with everything that they need and whatever choices they need. So that's my initial response. I don't know if there was another question you wanted me to answer first.
No, that's a great start. Ida, let's hear from you.
Yeah, we define it similarly as being unable to afford safe, hygienic products to manage your period. And we like to include also, being able to manage your period with dignity. And as was mentioned before, having the access to education around menstruation and periods is also included in how we define period poverty.
And then Abigail, your organization is a little bit different because you're specific to UIC. Can you kind of talk about that?
Yes, so thank you again for having us here to share more about this very important topic. So yeah, we still define period poverty generally as a lack of financial access to period products, as well as that we see a lot that lack of menstrual education growing up currently, and body literacy as well. And so in our work, we started out not really seeing period products available for free in our bathrooms. We also had students at one point in some of our own personal surveys, evaluation surveys, we just asked people, have you ever experienced you're not able to afford period products? And that was the biggest eye-opener, seeing that about 1 in 5 students and people in our UIC community weren't able to have access to that. And then with the pandemic, even less access. And so, yeah, that's how we've defined it. And we also understand that when people don't have period products, they'll sometimes have to weigh this option. Do I have to afford food? Do I pay for my bills? So that's one of the decisions that people make in terms of with period poverty.
And that's a great point that I'm actually going to get to in just a second. But before we jump into what period poverty can look like, I want to jump to the tampon tax because it's something that's talked about in this space a lot. And Ida, I'm going to throw this one to you.
Yeah, so the tampon tax really refers to a tax on any menstrual product. And Illinois was one of the first state to take away the tampon tax in 2016. And unfortunately, a lot of states are still taxing these products, which, is ridiculous because this is, nobody with a period has any choice in whether or not they get a period. You have to have these products to take care of your needs.
And it's great that in Illinois, we don't have the tampon tax anymore, but nationally, like you said, this is an issue. So Damaris, as someone who works more on a national level, can you kind of touch on that a little bit?
Yes, there are currently still 22 states that tax menstrual products, and that's something that we're on a mission with, working with coalition folks on the ground to ensure that this is really one of the key avenues to start to bring the conversation at the legislature that period products are an essential need. Eradicating the tampon tax is not the end result. It is a step so that we can then increase access. It is something that we really are passionate about ensuring that we eliminate, so that once legislatures and state governments start recognizing that this is not a luxury item, because that's the reality with a lot of products, they are taxed because they are luxury items, whereas in some states, like boots in Texas, for example, some things are not taxed, whereas things like period products are. And so I think it just kind of varies on the state. And so that's something that we're working on with, in partnership with, like I said, there's coalitions and incredible groups around the country. And that is really one way to help recognize this is an essential need. And now let's continue talking about the access and how we need them free in public spaces. It's really the goal that we want to work toward, to really increase access to period products to all who need them when they need them.
Yeah, it's definitely not a luxury item. I can think of so many things I'd rather buy than buying pads or tampons. But let's talk about why free products are so important. And Abby, this question's for you.
I think you said it well, Dama, but we don't, and Annabelle, we don't choose this. And yeah, we don't choose this. This is a very important product to, free products are very important for folks because people will sometimes use other avenues. They'll use their products for longer than is recommended. They'll use other things. Sometimes for folks that means socks, that sometimes means newspapers, sometimes things that they hand make themselves, but it's not necessarily easy for them to dry or reuse. So it is definitely a safety thing. It is also a thing about dignity. We people who have periods, people who are women and have periods, we deserve equality in this and equity in this matter. And for students, where I think that particular place in our lives, we're trying to learn, we're trying to focus in school, and having to worry about that while on campus, while in a learning environment, and even off campus now that we're online is something that is so basic and so easy to solve through education about stigma, which is one of the root causes for this period poverty that sort of got ignored. But yeah, I think that's the biggest one, being students and wanting to go into the future and be active participants in our society, and having this very simple thing be the systemic issue is a problem.
Yeah, 100%. And I think also, like, when you're a student, you already have way less disposable income at your hand. Like, this shouldn't be another issue or another thing that you have to budget for. But we actually have a comment from someone watching. So someone watching on the YouTube channel actually tonight, they founded a group for girls in Ghana, and they said, I grew up in a small village in Ghana, and I had no access to sanitary pads or having enough education on what I needed to know to take care of for myself. And yeah, I think that's exactly like what we're talking about tonight. It's not just the lack of products, it's the lack of education. You can have the products, but if you don't know what to do with them or how often, you should be changing them out, then, it's just as bad. And going back to something that you said earlier, Abby, I think that there's misconceptions about who actually experiences period poverty, partly because of the word poverty. When people first learn about this issue, they often assume it affects mostly houseless people living in extreme poverty, and it does, but that's not necessarily the case for everyone. Ida, can you speak on the common misconceptions about poverty and how different people can experience period poverty?
Yeah, I think one thing that we don't really talk about a lot is how expensive it can be to be poor. You know, if you're holding down multiple jobs, if you don't have a car, you might not be able to get to a Costco or a Walmart to buy your product in bulk. And you have to go to the corner store where the product is going to be a lot more expensive. And, you know, just things like not having access to laundry can be a determining factor in whether somebody makes it to school. If you're on your period, if you're, you know, having an accident or, you know, bleeding through your clothes, you have to have access to laundry. And if you don't, then you might have to stay home. And obviously that's an unfortunate situation that nobody should be in. So I think, I think there's, you know, there's, you know, period poverty for those that live on the street looks very different from period poverty for somebody who, you know, have most of the things that they need, but, you know, maybe there's a month here and there where they can't afford the product that they need versus somebody who can never afford the product. So, you know, there's different situations that different individuals are in.
No, that's the point I was trying to make, that it looks different for everyone. You can't assume someone's situation. And learning about people's varying experiences with period poverty got me curious about how it can look different in people's lives. So I asked some local survey respondents to share their stories, and this is what they had to say.
What period poverty meant for me was when I was using a pad, when I was on my period using a pad and it was time for me to change it, I would go to the bathroom and a lot of the time I wouldn't change it even though it was time for me to change it, because that just meant I would have less of them. So instead what I would do is, I remember I would take toilet paper and I would blot my pad.
I wasn't able to get my pads because they were so expensive. At that time, I wasn't financially stable. So it was really hard for me to get resources to try to get some pads. I finally found Nourishing Hope. They gave me a few pads. They helped me with some food. You know, it's great. But it's definitely something that I wouldn't want any woman going through, because it's something so natural that your body does. So it's like, we shouldn't have to be you know, thinking about whether we want to buy pads or something to eat.
Yeah, it was a struggle between figuring out the times when I was homeless or jobless, like with the little money that I had, was I going to get products, sanitary products, or was I going to eat?
It's, am I going to react a different way to whatever products that I'm used to, or the cheapest products at that point? And then I make a choice, because I'm really sensitive to things. And so if I need, you know, higher quality stuff or fully organic stuff, am I going to pay that difference for it? And this was something in college and it hadn't come out yet, but do I make and pay that difference, or is it going to be, can I get to work, or will I end up walking? Like that, those couple dollars used to make a big difference.
And it was scary. I did have to think about it like a few times before I went, because I'm just like, they're going to judge me, or they're going to, you know, it's scary. It's scary. And to this day though, like, I just feel like it is scary, but you can do it because you need it. You know, like sometimes it's okay to ask for help.
I think it was a bigger thing than I expected it to be. I never thought I would have to deal with it on the scale of being a man with a period. So that was another layer of doing it by myself, especially because I didn't have any other people like me around. I didn't have a community like.
Or sometimes even at work, I used to work at Planned Parenthood, and they had pads there, so I would just, you know, be like to my manager, hey, you know, I need some pads. Is it cool if I take 10?
I had like an upbringing where, like, you know, my parents made sure I had everything I needed, but like, I think it's more about like what kind of products like I had access to. You know, the general trend is like, oh, like if something is more clean, it's usually more expensive. And, you know, for period products, we don't know what's in them a lot of times. And when we do, it's like, oh, like, should that be in there?
A lot of it was self-discovery in comparison to my peers that are there. And that, I think, is one of the biggest things that leads also to period poverty, because it's the lack of knowledge. It's the ignorance that comes around it, and you're not given, everything else is all the stigmas are given to you, societal norms and expectations are, but like what to do is not given you.
So I've watched this video so many times because I'm the one who edited it, and it's so shocking to me, some of the experiences that these people went through. And I wanted to get, your guys' reaction to it, but we actually have a question from a viewer. So I want to get to that first. So the viewer watching tonight says that they can't afford organic products, even if they have negative reactions to cheaper products. How do people navigate a situation like this? And this is for any of you.
There are other products, that is possible to try, like a menstrual cup or reusable pads. Unfortunately, I don't know if that's going to work for that person, but, reusable products are sometimes a little bit, more gentle on the body.
That's a good point, because I think that there's also stigma surrounding reusable products, and that's another barrier that we have to break down, but a lot of people prefer them and use them. So that was a good answer. Thank you.
Can I jump in and share? I know sometimes even accessing the reusable products is difficult. It's a financial investment. And I definitely want to just shout out the Period Collective and other organizations that are taking reusable products and helping to distribute them. So definitely try to seek out those options too, that are giving them out for free. And I know there's some companies that are even giving samples and deals. So I hope that helps.
No, that's helpful. Thank you very much. And we'll definitely link some of those in the write-up that we publish after this. So I'm going to be tagging you for that, Abby. But I also want to touch on gender norms. In the past few decades, conversations about menstrual equity have largely been led by cisgender women. But it's important to note that period poverty is not just a woman's issue. Not every woman has a period, and not everyone who has a period identifies as a woman. Damaris, can you talk about the importance of making the space gender inclusive and how your organization has contributed so far?
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge opportunity that we now have in our communities to speak about people who menstruate. And a lot of people have initial reactions to it, really concerned. And that is a whole conversation with some people about only all women menstruate. Well, let's talk about people who are pregnant. They're not menstruating. Does that mean they're not women? Let's talk about people who have experienced menopause and are going through that, or perimenopause. Does that mean they're not women if they're no longer menstruating? I'm currently on birth control, and I am not menstruating every month, and I identify as woman. And so I am a woman, and I am not actually menstruating every month currently. And that doesn't change my gender identity. Whereas there are some people who menstruate and identify as men, and they menstruate, and it doesn't make them any less of a man or more. I mean, I think it's just kind of the reality and matter of fact, where we are assuming that women and having your period is one and the same, and it is not. So I think starting off with that, kind of reminding if people disagree, just because we often say when we refer, especially in advocacy spaces, we talk about people who menstruate or menstruators. We are not eliminating women, of course not. That is an identity that we highly and of course work with, but we recognize that we work with people who menstruate that identify of all genders or are non-binary, and that's okay. And so especially in the advocacy spaces, we're really trying to make sure that that is something that we use our language and are really mindful to not exclude folks who menstruate and are not women. Now, how we do that, specifically one opportunity that we've really been able to influence and really have an impact in is in legislation. For example, there are some bills and some legislators that have reached out to us that we've worked with when they're about to introduce a bill, and they're very excited. They're like, look at this bill on feminine hygiene products and how we are going to have them in all women's restrooms. So we're like, great. Can we discuss adjusting the name feminine hygiene products to menstrual products? I mean, that's the first step. Let's just talk about that. And can we consider having them in all restrooms? And then we kind of bring down from that. So we're happy to share that in Oregon, a bill was passed and signed that the access bills, which is to get free period products, is in all school restrooms, male, female, and gender inclusive, which is awesome. In California, I mean, it was stripped out. That was how it was presented, and through committees, it was stripped down. And hear a lot of conversations and how it passed. Y'all know legislation and how exciting it is in between, from when it's introduced to when it's passed. In California, the access bill is that it is included in all women's restrooms, gender inclusive restrooms, and at least one men's restroom. So there is progress there. We want to do more, but it's little things like that that we really are trying to ensure that this is done in action and not just in lip service. So how do we really increase access to products for folks who need them when they need them? I mean, this also, for folks that do implement these policies, I mean, that's a whole other, we're working with, in Illinois, of course, these bills pass, but then we need to identify implementation has been a struggle. And this is happening all over the country. It's really hard to actually implement the bills once they are. But even things like conversations we've had with school districts on, what if you also add a trash can in the men's restrooms? Because that's often not discussed. So maybe you're trying to be inclusive, but then you have pads or tampons. And if it's someone who's a man goes to the men's restrooms, they're menstruating, there's no trash cans in men's restrooms. So it's little things like that that I see we've been able to have an impact in, and just kind of shine a light in recognizing that. And also just the language that we use, and how do we recognize people who menstruate so that they see themselves, anybody who menstruates really sees themselves in legislation, in policies, and actually getting the products that they need. So that's kind of one of the key ways that I would highlight.
Yeah, I mean, you touched on so many great points, and honestly, this issue could be a community conversation on its own. So yeah, I mean, there's just so much there, but I'm glad that you're working towards, and we're seeing more legislation that supports more gender inclusivity. We've talked about how we've talked about how we fight identity and fight period, but I want to spend a bit of time examining the lasting impacts of inequity. So how does this whole space go beyond access to products and work towards marginalizing people and their opportunities? So how does it hold people back? How is period poverty more than just not having the products that you need? And that can, any of you.
I think it impacts every part of somebody's life when they don't have the product they need. If you don't have product, some individuals can't go to school. It's hard to hold down a job if you're worried about bleeding through your clothes. If you're in that kind of cycle of struggling with poverty, and you have a job interview and you don't have the product that you need, it's really hard to focus during an interview if you're worried about what's going on with your body. Even things like being able to play a sport or participate in other, extracurricular activities through school or otherwise. When you don't have the product you need, you can't fully participate in life.
No, it's such a huge distraction. And I also want to ask Abigail, how are young people particularly impacted with negative outcomes?
Thanks for asking. So yeah, I definitely agree. It's a long-term, probably generational issue. And I would say for young folks and young adults too, I guess, it probably impacts us in so many ways. So I want to also highlight that Black and brown people are definitely more vulnerable and more at risk. A national study was showing that they are more likely to miss school, to leave class early, come to class late, or miss out on those types of opportunities like what was just said. And I think personally, not feeling lack of control, lack of body literacy, body understanding is a long-term issue. I really appreciate the person in the chat sharing about their experience growing up in Ghana. I would say, just thinking about my own family back in Nigeria, and just the shame that comes with not feeling confident in our bodies, not feeling like we're able to manage our periods and afford to do so in a confident way is related. And we're hopefully going to start doing a survey at my university to understand sort of what are the menstrual attitudes of students overall. So people who have periods, people who don't have periods. And some of the things that we do know that they're going to share is that they sometimes they don't know when to go to the doctor. They don't know how to navigate the doctor. And so these are all related. And I feel like conversations like these open the door to talking about stigma and shame and the taboo of it all. And yeah, so I think this particularly affects people by not feeling like they can advocate for themselves.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much. I mean, that was a perfect way to wrap this up because unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for this panel section. But I'm grateful to you all for participating tonight. Damaris, we'll see you soon in the next section. Ida and Abigail, thank you so much for being here and sharing.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you
for having us.
So now that we've discussed what period poverty is, let's dig into that pesky stigma surrounding it. As I was reporting on this issue locally, I got in contact with Illinois State Representative Barbara Hernandez, who's the youngest Latina in the Illinois State. Sorry, she's the youngest Latina to serve in the Illinois House. She's worked on several legislations, including the 2021 bill requiring Illinois schools to provide free menstrual products in all bathrooms from grades 4th through 12th. This is a video that Barbara Hernandez submitted for this event.
As a Latina, it's very hard. I can go back to when my mom just introduced a period to me. In the Latino culture, they're somewhat conservative when it comes to like personal hygiene, personal life. They're embarrassed to talk about. Sexual education was definitely not a conversation that many parents want to have, especially Latino parents. So when it came to menstrual hygiene, one day I was around 12, 13 years old, and my mom just said, hey, one day you're going to bleed. Don't get scared. Here's some information. Just tell me and we'll figure it out. That was it. It was never told like what it is, what this means, how to like take care of myself in that way as well. So I wasn't aware, like I didn't know that I was going to get cramps. I didn't know what are some things that I can take. And I think early on, a few months before I got my period, I had cramps. I had very bad cramps that I landed in the hospital several times because I didn't know what this was. And my parents, of course, they just see me like in a little ball, trying to figure out like what's wrong with her. So when I got to the hospital and they gave me like a warm pad to put on my abdomen, I was like, oh, I feel much better. My parents were like, well, this is like another $1,000 down the drain since she's in the hospital when we were in the ER. But once again, they never explained to me that maybe this is cramp.
It's been interesting to hear everyone's stories about how they learned about their period and how they feel about it. While each individual has a unique perspective and lived experience, we can notice patterns in the words and feelings our survey respondents felt associated with menstruating. Take a look at this slide and notice how many more negative words there are than positive. So we have tired. So the words that are the biggest are the ones most commonly used. So pain, painful, cramps, annoying, messy, uncomfortable, blood, inconvenient. Some of the ones that stand out to me: sad, dirty, awful, but also womanhood. So there's a little bit of a mix, but it does seem like the negative words outweigh the positive words. When we look at responses this way, it's easy to see how commonly the media depictions of periods shape the narratives we create for ourselves about our own bodies. So let's talk more about our stories and talk more about who's writing them. And as a reminder, we'd love to hear your stories and your questions, especially if you have children. How have your conversations about menstruation gone with them so far? Leave a comment wherever you're watching, and it could be included in the discussion later on. Our second round of panelists are here to help us unpack this all. Damaris Pereda is joining us again. She's the National Programs Director of Period. Welcome back. And we have Dr. Samina Rahman, aka Gyno Girl on social media. And she's an OBGYN specialist at her clinic, the Center for Gynecology and Cosmetics. We also have Yesenia Rafael Vargas with us tonight, and she's a certified nurse midwife with Esperanza Healthcare Centers. Thank you all for joining us this evening and welcome. So based on survey responses and the stories that we heard, many of us first learn about periods from our mother, either before we get it or because we start it. A first period is a core memory in a person's life, and we carry the feelings, ideas, and sometimes the traumas that form at this moment with us for the rest of our lives. Dr. Rahman, a lot of your social media content is focused on sex-positive education. Can you share your thoughts on what an appropriate age would be to start talking about children about menstruation?
Yeah, actually, and I actually have two girls, and one of them's 10 years old, and she already knows what a menstrual cycle is, and and she's not close to hitting puberty yet, but she is, as many girls do actually have their first period at age 10. But I actually made it a point when her class was going to have a puberty talk to be at that talk, because what I find is, either looking at, my own upbringing as a daughter of immigrants that came over from Pakistan, where there's huge stigmas around menstruation, around sex, around everything, women's health related. And I see the consequences of it in my office every day. But, I think as early as, 8, 9 years old, girls should start learning about, this is a possibility. Like, when I menstruated, and my daughters were around, Mama, and they come, the kids always come into bathrooms with you, and they're always like, Mama, you're bleeding. I'm like, yeah, this is a normal thing that women do. And so, from an early age at like 5 or 6, my daughter would hand me a pad and be like, hey, here, Mom, you're bleeding. And it was one of these things where it was like, oh no, she's bleeding. It was more like, oh, okay, Mama's bleeding this month. This is just what happens. And so, my goal is for her and the patients I take care of and the students I talk through. I go to different schools sometimes and to give the discussions as well, so that this is looked at as a normal biologic process, that we shouldn't think it's disgusting, that this is the fruit of life. We are the origins of life, when it comes to our wombs. And there, as if you live long enough, you're going to hit puberty and you're going to hit menopause, and those are the two areas that we discuss very little about. And I think that that's why when I see 40-something-year-old women in my office and I'm talking to them about perimenopause and then eventual menopause, they're in shock, because again, their mothers didn't talk to them about it. It was just something that was natural. It was just something that you just had to suck up, and now we know that's not the case. And I think the consequences of not learning appropriate education early leads to, not knowing when things are not normal, right? If you don't go to school because every period is so painful that you can't focus, you're vomiting, or you're just in extreme discomfort and you're bloated, whatever the case may be, that's not normal. Like, you should not be in a situation like that. And your parents should then take you to see, a gynecologist, your pediatrician, whoever, you're comfortable discussing this with. And so I think that these issues, you just really snowball on top of each other. And I have patients with conditions like endometriosis or fibroids or other things that have just lived with it for years on end. And it wasn't until, I maybe bring it up and I'm like, well, that's not actually normal. Or like even with sexual pain, that's not actually normal. And when they realize that it could be common that other people have it, but it's not normal, that physiologically, there might be something else going on, then, the bells start ringing and they're like, oh, wow. So, my this happens to my sister, this happens to my mom, like this is something maybe genetic, we get into these big discussions, but it all starts from the lack of education. We fail our kids in school when it comes to educating them on reproductive health. As parents, I think, I can definitely say my parents failed me in that respect. They've done a lot of great things for me, but in the one area of reproductive health and medicine, that was sort of failed on, that was something that I had to pick up on myself. And I think a lot of parents are probably guilty of that because their parents kind of failed them. And it was just something that was so embedded in the culture. And it's just not American culture. It's just not, developing world culture. It is cross culture. I mean, it is international, this phenomenon.
Right, it's like a cycle that it's hard to break. right?
Yes.
Because it continues on when you're getting a period at a young age and you're learning about it either from a stigmatized view or just, you know, a parent who might not necessarily know a lot of the biology behind what's going on with you. You kind of carry that with you for the rest of your lives. We actually have another comment from a viewer. So one person watching on YouTube says, period education in schools would be a great way for those experiencing period poverty to talk about it and feel comfortable getting help. So how can schools at the local level play a stronger role in this education? That is, again, a question for either of you.
I mean, you know, I think that either someone at the school has to advocate for it or a parent has to advocate for it. But, you know, I mean, even myself, when I injected myself into my daughter's school and said, I'm going to come to your puberty talk just because I want to make sure all the word, you know, what you're learning is, you know, appropriate, correct. You learn the right biology, the right vocabulary. But I think, you know, it has to, you know, a lot of what I teach my own patients is self-advocacy, right? Like we have to know what we know so that we can advocate for ourselves. And in the same respect, I think, you know, other people that at the schools, the teachers, educators, you know, parents, they all have to advocate to get better education to our students. And I think the majority of parents are thirsty for it. They want better education.
Yes, Sanya, as a midwife, I really want to get your perspective on that question.
Well, I think one of the things that's happening is we're still just so behind even with sex ed. And so, you know, getting our schools appropriate sex ed that isn't just telling you like, you know, when I was in school, they basically told you how to make a baby, you know, the miracle of life. Everybody watched that video, but they didn't tell you about contraception, didn't talk about periods. I think, you know, once we can get up to speed with where we're supposed to be with that.
I think Sanya froze, at least for me. So I'm gonna keep going on, and we touched earlier on how many of us have to unlearn things, right? The negative associations that we place on menstruation, but unlearning, at least in my opinion, is a lot more difficult than learning. So how do we prevent placing shame on others while we're still in this process, especially for parents? And I'm gonna send this one to Damaris.
I mean, that's a really good question. How do we unlearn what we are trying to teach? Like it's kind of all together. And I just want to echo in terms of what everyone has shared about the education. This is all culture. We're trying to change culture when we're talking about education. We're trying to shift the culture of stigma when it comes to periods and menstrual health and being okay with talking about it. And so I did want to just add on a little bit because it's connected. I know we talked, the question before was like how to kind of make this more accessible. And one of the things we advocate for a lot as well is, you know, how can we have standards for English, like we talked about earlier with like we have standards for math, standards for science, you know, how do we embed menstrual health education standards and or like curriculum more within schools and school nurses to really empower for this to be a thing, because the more it's talked about, the more it's normalized, the easier it's going to be for us all to just kind of recognize it. And so that's kind of one of the first things that I want to know. And in terms of how do we unlearn it, I mean, we can just start by talking about it. Talk about your period, talk about the cramps and the products you use and the type of products that is. I mean, within our own circles, it starts with that. Let's talk about it in our homes. Let's talk about it. And then it kind of expands like in our network, in our workplaces, you know, is our period products being accessible where you work, you know, is that something, are you able to take time off? How are we diagnosing and talking about disorders? Because that's another thing where people don't talk about their periods. So if you maybe have heavy menstrual bleeding your whole life and you just think that that's normal, it turns out there may be something underneath that maybe there's a fibroid or maybe some sort of endometriosis or something, but it takes years because of the history of medical racism. Like if we're just going to go into like even diagnose, it just starts with a conversation. The more we talk about it, the more we're open about it, not ashamed, it really can help us identify, oh, I don't get that. Do you? And how does your period look? What color is the blood that comes out? Like, you know, what do you see? And so I think that's one of the ways that all of us can continue to take action. And clearly, if you're on this call you're already doing that. And since we're in Illinois, I just want to give a specific shout out to She Votes Illinois, just because of the incredible work that they've been doing to help pass legislation there with menstrual equity. And I think that is like, it's really finding like local groups and joining places where like this is going to be talked about and then addressed both in a community level and also in a systemic, what does it look like for legislation, which takes longer to implement, but I think there's a way to get there to kind of do it systematically. So we can just talk about it. And I can't wait. And I love it when we see in now more than ever in legislation around the country, people are talking about periods and menstruation. And that is a wonderful historic thing that we haven't seen in the past. So much momentum around the country about it.
I also want to second that shout out to She Votes Illinois, because they're doing amazing work and they've helped me so much in this project, even connecting me with a couple of you all. So thank you. Really quickly, this is going to be a brief conversation. What are some ways to get men, cisgender men specifically, so our dads, our brothers, friends, teachers, on board about open, shameless dialogue about menstruation? And actually, Yesenia, I'm happy to see you back, so maybe you can take this question.
Yeah, I actually have a house full of boys, so it's something that I think of, the more that we're talking about it, like some of the others have said in our circles, among ourselves, we have to talk to our boys, our brothers, our husbands. We have to feel comfortable with it, and just, we have to talk to our partners, our children, so that they know, like Dr. Rahman was talking about, you never have a moment of peace in the bathroom. It's okay for boys to know. I have a 4-year-old that was, very, very present in my most recent pregnancy and knows that, the baby was inside my belly. I think just, using the right language and increasing those conversations is going to help us kind of change the way things are.
Thank you. And thank you for raising your sons that way, because I think that's really important to kind of push forward this movement. It's safe to say that we've established that there is a stigma, and I think it especially holds true in communities of color. As we heard in the video earlier, the topic of menstruation is avoided altogether in many households. So this is kind of for whoever wants to jump in. Can you tell me about not having these conversations at home and how that can perpetuate the shame and the stigma?
Well, I think if, I'll just jump in because we didn't have these conversations at home. So I know how it, affected me, but I see how it affects my patients on a day-to-day basis too, because, when it comes to understanding, their menstrual cycle or menopause or whatever, they're like, well, no one ever talked to me about it. So again, if you don't talk about it, if you don't know the right vocabulary to speak about your anatomy, if you don't know, a lot of what I do is just educating my patients with models and everything. And when I show them what a vulva looks like and what, clitoris, clitoral all of that, when I show them models of stuff, it's very interesting to me and then I show them their own, on a personal mirror. I give them a mirror and I say, let's look at your anatomy. I think it's very interesting the way that they're half of the time they've never even looked down, like they've never actually looked at their own anatomy. And so if you don't know what's normal and you don't know, what anatomically and biologically should be happening, then of course, the problems that develop secondary to that are going to be missed. So the lack of discussion, the lack of education, again, just causes this perpetual problem and just contributes to the stigma, as you discussed. So I think that, the hard part is sort of educating the adults who, already went through the process and didn't learn it and didn't, it's almost like you have to give adult sex education. I talk about that with my colleagues sometimes, like, yeah, we really should be giving adult sex ed classes because, a lot of times when you get to that point where you're having issues with sexual dysfunction or, your reproductive cycles, whatever, you don't even know where to start or where to go with that because nobody has ever talked to you about it. And mom was the word, and you don't even know the vocabulary to describe it, So I think that's what ends up happening. Because of the lack of discussion, education, the stigma just gets perpetuated, and then we end up in this situation where we're suffering as patients, as women, as daughters, as everything. So
yeah, and to your point, the stigma can look different for everybody. So I learned so much from everyone's perspectives who I spoke with about this issue, but when I spoke with Vincent specifically, who appeared in the video earlier, I realized that there's so many layers to the stigma here. So in his case, at one point he was dealing with the stigma of not only having a period, but being a transgender man. So Damaris, can you talk about what work still needs to be done in terms of trans rights in these conversations? What homework would you give people listening?
Well, we've had a lot of progress, but there's still so much work to do. And I think it starts with recognizing how are we being inclusive and recognizing that, again, not all women menstruate and not all people who menstruate are women. It starts off with that. I think that's the first thing to consider. And in terms of the education, I mean, let's continue in strengthening that. I mean, one of the things we want to highlight, there was a study that we had done back in 2021, and 76 of US students around the country in the US, 76% of students said that they feel more that they know more about the biology of a frog than the biology of a human female body. And so I think we just learn more about dissecting frogs and everything about it, and not actually about the menstrual cycle, and that's not taught. And so I think recognizing that, let's start with that education, like Dr. Samina shared. How do we increase that all around? How do we talk about it more, so that we are not stigmatized? And in terms of the homework about it, I mean, everyone is in a different space, so I don't want to be like, you go do this. You know, everyone's in different communities, different impacts, but I think the homework I charge all of us to continue is to talking about the stigma, talking and asking questions about, and not being intrusive. Also, just because someone is trans doesn't mean that you're gonna, you know, it's not our space to ask whether they menstruate or not. That's actually not our business. So we respect that. I think it's just learning more and getting the chance to recognize like just what the menstrual cycle is, and then making sure that we recognize that this is an issue in terms of not everyone has access to the products they need. So I think that's the thing that we can identify, and how can we provide products to local organizations like the panelists we've seen on this organization, folks on the ground who are providing products to people who need them. So whatever call to action that fills within your capacity, you know, whether it's talking about it, whether it's donating products, whether it's connecting with your legislators to talk about policy and seeing how we can do this. And Illinois has done an incredible job. There's so much progress, and Illinois has been an example and a leader. And so, but there's still so much work to be done around the country. And so, yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, but everyone, let's just keep talking about it.
No, you did answer the question. Thank you very much. Very, very quickly, because we're running out of time, but I do want to touch on this. Religion, of course, plays a huge role in how we understand our bodies and our bodily functions. So in Chloe's case, in the video we saw earlier, they were raised Mormon. And in Baghdad, where Sarah lives, Iraqi culture is very much intertwined with Islam. So can any of you touch on these religious aspects and how it relates to the period stigma?
Yeah, I can actually speak to that as well. I grew up Muslim. I know the stigma around being a menstruator, as well as, you know, being a practicing Muslim. I know, and it's similar to a lot of Orthodox communities, whether it's, you know, the Catholic faith or Jewish and Mormons. I think similarly, like there's just some impurity that's thought that happens, like the menstrual cycle in and of itself is an impure time, or, you know, it's so, you know, there's, even though I think it's happening less and less. I mean, even in some of the developing countries and like Nepal, India, and some parts of Africa, they definitely still, you know, have these menstrual huts where, you know, where individuals who menstruate have to go out, you know, during their time of their cycle because of the shame associated with it. You can't enter. I know even with Hinduism, you're not supposed to enter the temple during your cycle. The same with Islam. You're not. You're given, you know, an exception not to pray during and not to fast. And I think it becomes a big issue during the holy month of Ramadan when we're supposed to fast. And I know that a lot of Muslim patients and friends of mine are always like, oh, we have to fake fast in front of people so they don't know we're menstruating. Whereas, you know, I think that's some of the things that happens because, you know, you're not supposed to do certain things during the time of your cycle because of the not only the shame associated with it, but just what's considered like, you know, impure or not clean, you know, for
yeah. And I think that, you know, that case with so many religions, unfortunately, and religions are so important to so many people. You all have been making amazing, great points that we could talk about all day, but unfortunately we've run out of time for tonight's discussion. So we'll have to leave it at that. But there's plenty more to unpack here. So I hope that this is just the start of more community-focused conversations about menstrual equity. I'd like to thank our wonderful panelists, Dr. Rahman, Yesenia, Damaris, thank you so much for participating. And to the experts who we talked with earlier, Ida Melbye and Abigail Suleman. Thank you all for sharing your insights. This conversation would not have been possible without the 204 people who responded to the survey and shared their personal stories. Thank you all for taking so much time to contribute to the conversation. My reporting on period poverty has been supported by my fellowship with the USC Annenberg Center for Health Journalism. This event was produced as a journalism partnership between Illinois Latino News and WBEZ Chicago. And I want to say thank you to Kavitha Cardoza and Catherine Stifter for mentoring me through this project. Special thanks to the Trans Chicago Empowerment Center, She Votes Illinois, Share the Dignity Australia, and the Chicago ward offices in the 22nd, 25th, and 33rd wards who helped distribute the survey and connect us with our panelists tonight. And before we say goodnight, please let us know what you thought about this event. You can share your feedback by filling out our post-event survey, which will be available via email later this week. Thank you to everyone who tuned into this community conversation. Stay warm out there, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time.